In late 5th century Sui dynasty, you wake up one morning with an empty stomach and no way to satisfy the rumbling of your belly. You see, you've been living in poverty your whole life with no hope of a better future, and every time you think of dinner, the only image that comes to your mind is a plate with a small portion of rice and a tiny fish. But one day you hear news that the government is hosting a test in their capital, and if you passed, you could work as a bureaucrat for the Chinese bureaucracy. So you teach your kids as much as you know and try to give them the education that you never had so that hopefully they can pass these exams and live a better life. Hello, welcome to the podcast, or more specifically the history podcast. I'm still kind of working on the name. Anyways, today's episode is about the Chinese civil service exams, which were the tests that the father in poverty heard about. And for our episodes, we normally have a driving question that we'll be trying to figure out. And today's driving question is, what were the Chinese civil service exams and how they have influenced Chinese culture? And not only Chinese culture, but how it has influenced the world in general and affected humanity as a whole. Alright, so before I even start trying to answer our questions, you have to know what these exams were. So here's a basic rundown of what the civil service exams were. China in the 6th century is a bureaucracy, and they need people to staff the government. So what they decide to do is allow men, whether they were rich or poor, to take a rigorous examination, and if they pass, they join as bureaucrats in the government. Now to help explain this a little better, I've gathered a group of people on a group chat server and we'll be conducting a little experiment. So I have two groups of people. Hello, group 1.
Hello.
Hello, group number 2.
Hi.
Hello.
So I had these two groups answer some trivia questions to kind of serve as a copy of the real-life civil service examinations. Group 1, or the rich, only has to answer one question, while Group 2, or the poor, has to answer 2 questions. And you need to answer every question right for you to be able to pass the test. Now keep in mind that the real-life Chinese civil service exams had the same questions for everyone. So now you might have the question, why? Why does the rich get a better chance at passing than people in poverty? Well, I did this because the rich citizens in China would have a better education than the people in poverty, which inherently makes the rich people more knowledgeable and gives them a better chance at passing the real-life examinations. So now I'm going to give you 2 examples from the experiment. The first example is a participant from our lower class citizens, and the second example is from a participant from Group 1, or the upper class citizens. So here's the first example. How many soccer players should each team have on the field on the start of each game?
11.
Which boxer was known as the greatest, or quote, people's champion?
Muhammad Ali.
That was our lower class citizen, and here is our upper class citizen. Which boxer was known as the greatest, or people's champion?
John Cena.
So if you tally up all your points, you can see that in this case, the lower income person aced the exams and can now join the bureaucracy, while the rich person did not ace the exams and cannot. So all of this is to say that people in poverty can now move up in social class, if they're smart enough. And rich people don't just join the government because they're rich and have powerful friends. A quick little disclaimer before we start moving along with the episode. I am not fluent in Chinese, so therefore I'm very sorry for my mispronunciations of Chinese words. So now let's look at the history. Well, it all started with the Qin dynasty in 221 BC. The Qin dynasty created the first ever bureaucracy in China, and they needed people to staff their administration. So how the Qin dynasty went about this is they asked local officials who was the best candidate and just went on the local officials' word and appointed people that way. The Han dynasty kept the bureaucracy created by the Qin dynasty, but spiced it up a little, so to speak. Instead of asking local officials about who to add to their administration, they created a university to teach people about the Confucius government, and they tested them to actually see if they were worthy of joining their administration. This university was called Taisu. And at the end of the Han dynasty, Taisu was training 30,000 individuals to join their administration each year. You see, the Han dynasty did this because they thought their leaders should be extremely educated in things both like government and Chinese literature. So now we're going to skip a few years and go on to the Sui dynasty, who kept the Han dynasty system, but now added some exams. You see, the Sui dynasty didn't care about what connections you had with powerful people, or what social class you were in, or even what family you were born into. What the Sui dynasty really cared about was how well you did on the examinations that they held in their capital. So right now I want to paint a picture. Imagine in your head a shed or a shack. Now let's downgrade that to a 5-foot square area with walls on all sides. Now subtract one wall, add a bench at the farthest side away from that missing wall, and in front of that bench add a board raised just enough to be utilized as a table. Slap a roof on that image, and that's where you'll be staying all day and all night for 3 days. And you can see a real life version of your cozy house in the South River School of Naji, China. And in ancient scrolls, you can see pictures of rows of these cells with people roaming the rows to check up on your test takers. So in 618 AD, whenever the Tang dynasty emerges, they adopted the test made by the Sui dynasty, but made some minor changes. So now if you want to join the administration, you need to have knowledge on government, you need to be able to speak well, you need to know Chinese literature, poetry, math, law, and you have to be able to write, which includes calligraphy, essays, and just standard Chinese writing. Also in these exams, you had to be, quote, worthy and upright. Essentially, this means people like slaves, children of prostitutes, and criminals are not allowed to take the exams. These exams are held once a year and attracted roughly 2,000 test takers, but only about 1% of the people who took these exams actually passed and then were required to take another exam at the Board of Civil Office, where then if they passed that, they would join as a bureaucrat. Then in 960, when the Song dynasty emerged, they kept the same system, but installed some public schools so that everybody would have a chance to join the administration, because now they can actually have a decent education. This was especially for the poor and middle class who couldn't afford private schooling in the earlier dynasties. They also had to add a qualifying test to meet the demand of all the people that wanted to take these tests. If you pass this qualifier test, you will then go on to a 3-day examination held at the capital, and if you pass that, you take another exam at the palace with the emperor watching you. I think that would be terrifying. So eventually the Song dynasty passes and the Ming dynasty came along, and the Ming dynasty decided to keep the same system, but of course they made their own minor changes. Well, once the Ming dynasty eventually passes and the Qing dynasty comes along, they basically copied the Ming dynasty system, which at that point was basically flawless. But sadly, in 1905, the Qing dynasty completely abolishes the examination system. Okay, that was a lot to cover. 2,111 years to be exact. From the start of the Han Dynasty to when the exams were completely abolished. So now that we're done with our history, you might be asking, so what? What's the big deal? Well, let's get on to answering our driving question for today's segment. Well, probably the most obvious result of this system is that people in power were super smart and super qualified. Because before the system, people in power could be very underqualified if, let's say, a local official were to recommend an underqualified person. Also, with this new system, it brings a new look on life and society for a lot of people. Now even the peasants can become powerful if they're skilled enough. This creates a thing called social mobility in China. If you're poor, you don't have to stay poor your entire life. You can move up in life. It gives people in China the idea that you don't just have to do what your father did, and you can forge yourself a new path and live your own life without following in your parents' footsteps. And at this time, this was a super new and revolutionary idea. And people from China will spread this all around the world with the help of trade and just by them talking to people. And if we look at the world today, especially in America, most people don't do what their parents do. They choose their own job that they want to do. And going hand in hand with this, people in the world right now aren't based solely on how rich or powerful they are. People now understand better that you can also be of purpose by your skills and abilities and not just being super rich. And both of these ideas grew in popularity at this time because they were super new. So now let's talk about how these exams helped China at the time. Well, during the Song dynasty, public schools were created so that the smart and talented but sadly poor people could have a chance at passing the exams. So now people are able to get the education they previously couldn't afford for free. And children now have a reason to go to school and get an education because they want to pass these exams. And with this new motivation, the Chinese population on average became more knowledgeable because people want to go to school. And these civil service exams helped China be stable for centuries. So to kind of sum it all up, the Chinese civil service exams influenced the world through the ideas that came with it. These ideas were that people now hold more importance based on your skills and knowledge than where you were just born in the social ladder. Well, that's today's episode from the History Podcast, a production by Logan Hughes. I hope you guys all have a great day.